no one will come, but one person is watching, which is probably us. All right, so welcome everybody. Sorry for the technical delays, but today the plan was to discuss a book by Jeremy Waldron, The Harm in Hate Speech. Jeremy Waldron is a very distinguished legal philosopher, and he's originally from New Zealand. And we did reach out and invite him to Free Kiwis, but he wasn't able to do it. So we thought, well, we'll just read his book because we know that he has, sophisticated views on hate speech and why it's harmful. And, he's so influential that reading through this, I even suspect that he influenced the thinking behind the government's proposed hate speech laws. So I think it's important to understand these ideas. And obviously it's always good to get the best possible formulation of the views that you're discussing, even if you oppose them. So we thought this would be a really good thing for us to read. So yeah, Jeremy Waldron, The Harm in Hate Speech. And we've got 4 guests today. Well, I guess 2 of us are technically hosts. I'm James Kierstead. I teach in classics here at Vic. Maybe we should just say briefly who we are.
Yeah, I'm Michael Johnston. I still teach in the Faculty of Education, but I'm on my way out of the university to the New Zealand Initiative.
And I'm Evan Blackie. I'm a data scientist by trade.
And we have
Baptiste. Oh, he disappeared. Baptiste? That's very mysterious.
Get zoom up. Sorry, everybody. Just look at the zoom, man.
We do everything in the least efficient way. I see Zoom, but I don't see him.
He's bugged out of Zoom.
All right. Well, I guess we could just continue and see if he turns up again. Probably shouldn't live stream my Hotmail account.
He lost his connection.
All right.
So Baptiste will join us in due course. I'll introduce Baptiste since he can't introduce himself at the moment. He's just completed his PhD in education and philosophy, and he's particularly interested in philosophy for children and what it takes to get good philosophical thinking going in a culture.
All right, so hopefully Baptiste will join us in a minute, but we can just start out with trying to summarize the main ideas of this book. So, okay, so it's called The Harm in Hate Speech, and Waldron has a particular conception of hate speech. Does anybody want to talk about that? How does he view this issue?
Well, it seems to me that his underpinning idea is that hate speech laws should prohibit what he refers to as group libel. So, of course, we have in civil law in liberal democracies libel laws that prevent the publication of insulting or degrading or claims or things that undermine somebody's reputation. And if people violate those laws, then they can be sued in civil court. Waldron does point out in his book that sometimes libel laws have actually been on the criminal code, that people can in the past have been imprisoned for libel. And he kind of leverages that idea to say that we could have laws that prevent the libel of people on the basis of group characteristics. So if people publish nasty things about a particular race, or he focuses particularly on race in this book, but I guess theoretically a sexuality or a gender or something like that, then they could be subject to group libel laws that could see them prosecuted. So I think that is the underpinning notion and conception of what hate speech is. Would the rest of you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's fairly fair. I think he makes a case about hate speech itself not not being a particularly good term in his view, perhaps a bit misleading around the speech, whereas his emphasis is perhaps the written content. And that perhaps people start to think hate speech is a restriction on thinking, but his intention is not in that line. So,
yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. He definitely distinguishes speech from things that are published and therefore endure in a culture, whether it's in an actual publication or just somebody doing some graffiti on a wall somewhere. I think he sees the potential for much greater intimidation of certain groups if things are published in those kinds of ways than if somebody just has a drunken outburst or something like that. What's your view, Baptiste? Would you like to come in there and see what you see as the kind of underpinning ideas in this book?
Yeah. So building on that last idea, I think it was particularly interesting how you talked about the environment and almost the aesthetic quality, that it has when the environment does provide citizens with the assurance that they are all equal members in good standing, versus when it's defaced, when it's polluted by these hateful sort of posters or graffiti or symbols. And I thought that was quite interesting. I think I agree with your characterization of group libel as the sort of the main thing he focuses on. And I think, and then he goes through various objections and makes several nuances to his claim, but his central claim seems to be fairly clear throughout the book, and I think we've captured it mostly.
Okay, so that's a good point. So to start with, he's talking about group libel, and I think one of the interesting aspects of this is that he's not talking about individual libel, or it gets a little bit complicated because he wants to say something like hate speech is when group libel is involved, and it may be targeted at an individual, but it's always targeted as an individual, as a member of a group. So it's not necessarily hate speech if I say, I just hate Michael because he's annoying. If I say, I hate Michael because he's such a typical kind of Kiwi Australian, then that might become hate speech, depending. And although this is a good segue, I mean, there is actually a higher bar for Dworkin than that. So what would I have to say about Michael as a Kiwi Australian for that to qualify as hate speech in Waldron's view?
I think you'd have to make some generalizations about Kiwi Australians and why they're so bad and why they should be denigrated or not afforded the same rights as others, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think I'd have to go even further. I'd have to say something that would lead to public perceptions of Kiwi Australians plummeting to such an extent that they would risk, Kiwi Australians would risk having their rights taken away, and they would risk not being seen as equals in New Zealand society. That's a real worry, isn't it?
That sounds a bit high to me. Like, I think he puts the bar somewhat lower than that. As I understand it, it would be sufficient for a number of members of that group to feel as though their standing in society is undermined, rather than all of New Zealand, or I guess this one is odd, but rather than the general population coming to view them in that way.
I think you're right, Baptiste. I think that the emphasis that he places is on how members of that group how it will affect them in terms of a sense of intimidation or not being free to live their lives with dignity as others are, rather than necessarily any actual threat.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, but let's bring in, what do you think, Evan? Because maybe we can form a faction and then engage in hate speech against them.
Look, I think that he early on, he sort of resists going down let's define the line between sort of, perhaps dislikable speech and dangerous speech. And I probably didn't sort of read fully enough to know how he resolves that. But I guess one of the examples was around signage and the sort of the Jewish Defamation League, and that being a concern for the social environment. And so I suppose that overlaps with, the public perception and also an act in itself. So I guess I don't have a firm opinion.
No, but I think what you were saying is one of the things you said was it impacts on the public perception. And that's my worry about what you guys were saying, is because he does have passages where he emphasizes it's not supposed to be a subjective thing, right? So that's where he tries to distinguish his view from just things that cause people offense. So it's not just that Michael and his co-Kiwi Australians, or a good number of them, might feel that their standing was harmed or be offended. It's more, he wants to say that there's an objective sense in which a group's standing may be harmed in society, right? So, and then you have to think, well, what does he mean by objective sense? He means that society as a whole will think Kiwi Australians aren't deserving of citizenship in this country. And therefore, in that sense, it becomes objective, because if most of the country thinks that, then it's almost like a social fact.
Yeah, I think there's a little, I think you're almost right. He certainly distinguishes offence from an assault on dignity. But I'm not sure that, and maybe this is a little bit of sleight of hand on his part, that it can be as objective as all that, because I think that what he's alluding to is a risk that things will fall into this state in which people are actively persecuted, rather than reaching that state or having some objective evidence that that state will arise from what people say. What do you think about that, Baptiste?
I think that's right. I also feel like you're right, James, that either this collective assurance is sort of given by the public, so I suppose it can be withdrawn from the public a little bit, but I think I agree with Michael that it's more about the risk, and that's, I read him as mainly talking about two groups of people being affected by group libel. So first, the individual, the members of the group being sort of targeted with hate speech, but also I think he said the second group of people that he emphasized were hate mongers, or whatever the name is. And I think, say, your hateful graffiti, I think he emphasized the impact on the members of the group, and then secondly, on fellow haters of that group, who would then see their view of the group reinforced in some way. And I think the general public comes third in importance. But yeah, it's not super clear to me, to what extent the public opinion on the group matters as a criterion for what counts as hate speech.
What about the question of it being objective? Do you see a potential for an objective test under his criteria?
Yeah, I see the importance of not grounding it in people's subjective experiences, because then it becomes really difficult to distinguish what's just, I'm a devout Christian and you just offended me a lot, and that's hate speech, right? So I agree with the need for a more objective test. I'm not sure that it lies in, polling the general population. I don't know exactly what kind of objective test he has in mind, but I'm not sure that's what it would be.
It's actually a good point. I mean, we're still in this sort of expounding on what Waldron's saying phase, but I think there's room for an objection here, isn't there? That we have to ask precisely what he means by this objective sense that people aren't equal. How do you tell that society as a whole doesn't think people are equal? I mean, in some cases it may be obvious, right? So I think one of the things he's worried about is something like, Nazi Germany in the 30s. So there was lots of hate speech against Jews, the cartoons and movies and newspaper articles about them being evil. And then, of course, we know what happened with the Kristallnacht and the Holocaust that ensued. So in cases like that, it's fairly clear that Germans, or many Germans, enough Germans at the time, or maybe just the most influential ones, the Nazis, didn't view them as equal in that sense. So that's an obvious case, but it gets more difficult when we're talking about life in your average liberal democracy. How do you tell when certain types of speech really risk creating that kind of environment. And see here, I think he's exaggerating slightly the effect that individual jokes or even sort of individual comedy routines or TV shows might have, because it strikes me, for example, that, you know, if you watch The Simpsons 10 years ago, or you watch Family Guy even now, or shows like that, they often have jokes that are kind of teasing, well, you know, the British, the French, the Scots, you know, the way they speak or the way they do things, you know, sometimes it's just stereotypes, but there's lots of groups that are parodied in this way, even groups within the United States, you know. Now, maybe norms and mores have sort of turned against that slightly. And maybe you want to argue that's for a good reason. I mean, I kind of like that type of humor, to be honest. But it doesn't seem to me the case that if you have these jokes, or if you have these comedy shows on TV, it automatically leads to the French or the Scots losing their citizenship, or automatically leads to people with British accents not being viewed as equal human beings. So I think you can exaggerate the power of these jokes and these words, and I think Waldron does that. Is that fair?
I didn't touch on that, but yeah, not being a legal scholar or anything, I'd suggest, just, you know, of my own intuition, that you could come to a point where it would be easy to disregard that particular avenue, perhaps in some cases less than others, and humor is very subjective, but you might have a reasonably high bar that ensures that what, you know, an average person could see as, you know, reasonably good-natured, humorous. I guess a counterexample to that is that guy in France who's quite extreme. He does a sort of a Nazi imitation thing, and that style of humor, I guess, for some people is quite confrontational. So I don't know where that would fit, perhaps, if you know.
Well, I don't think Waldron is arguing against confrontational things or even offensive things, but things that. So there's a passage here which might help us. That this is a direct quote from the book, that a liberal democracy must take affirmative responsibility for protecting the atmosphere of mutual respect against vicious attack. So there is a subjective quality to that, to me, that it's the atmosphere or the kind of environment in which people are living that he wants to, sanitize is probably too strong a word, but he wants to kind of keep reasonably clean from very nasty stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that nobody, certainly not here, would want to defend a toxic atmosphere. But the question is whether, to me, the question is whether the legal avenue is the correct one for pursuing that, and how pure we can actually afford to be if we want to also protect an environment in which ideas and the contest of ideas which we would see as legitimate can thrive.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing about the point you just made, which it would seem, so if his worry is, say we're talking about France, his concern seems to be, well, what if France today becomes like 1930s Germany? I mean, I don't personally think that's particularly likely, but imagine there are these comedians and they have a very kind of acerbic, vigorous style. Maybe there's Charlie Hebdo, and you know, maybe they're making different types of jokes or jokes in different directions. But imagine that they make it so that France just becomes this incredibly anti-Semitic society, right? So that would then sort of pass Waldron's test for, we shouldn't have these types of speech. We should take measures to shut down certain types of speech. But if the test is an objective one interesting thing that comes out of this is that you should be more worried about speech and jokes that come from powerful people, right? So if you're just some nobody in a Paris bar and you make a joke, but it doesn't risk contributing to an environment that's toxic, then that's not that serious, right? Whereas if you have millions of Twitter followers or you're a famous comedian, that might mean that you contribute more, you potentially contribute more to this atmosphere of hatred. And therefore, that would lead to a situation in which the law might have to penalize certain people more heavily for the same types of acts, which to me is already an objection to that way of thinking. But maybe Waldron thinks that would be okay. But anyway, Michael, you might have wanted to go on to the sort of.
No, I think Baptiste is one.
Oh yeah, Baptiste, please.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I noticed in reading the book, and maybe you noticed it as well, is he chose throughout the book, he almost exclusively chooses quite extreme examples,
Yes.
right? So the burning crosses, the some
Swastikas
examples
and-
from history of pamphlets that were, absolutely nasty. And I think in some ways he's just taken on the easier argument, and he's taking on the easier argument that those clear cases should be regulated in the United States, because as I understand, they currently are not. I think he doesn't touch on those harder cases that we might be more interested in, those ones where, the offensive jokes or the ones that are going to be a lot harder to assess. So I didn't find a whole lot in this book to help us think through those cases, because he lives in a country where the nastiest examples are not currently regulated. And I think he mainly takes that on. And just to point out, I don't know even if this is who you were referring to, but Eric Zemmour, some of whose followers have been, doing Nazi salutes, is currently, a candidate to the presidential election happening in 2 weeks, and has between 10 and 15% of support in the country. So he's quite an influential person, which, just to contextualize that particular example.
And is your understanding, Baptiste, that those Nazi salutes are to be taken seriously? What is his real position? Is he promulgating deeply anti-Semitic or otherwise fascist ideas?
So he's extremely, no, his positions are extreme in terms of immigration and the rights of minorities. He's been himself actually prosecuted and for hate speech violations. But his positions, his platform are essentially immigration measures. There's not much in terms of, education or things that, a president platform has. So he believes in the great replacement theory, like uses it openly and explicitly, and therefore wants to force out, no more migrations to France, want to remove welfare benefits to migrants in France, and wants to open a ministry of remigration to take them back to their countries.
I see. Yes.
So this is interesting, though. I'm not necessarily intervening now to sort of defend Eric Zemmour in particular, but it just strikes me that there's another possible objection to Waldron here, which is that if you take this view that we need, above all, to avoid this toxic atmosphere, and if I'm right in what I was saying before, that Waldron would then also say that, well, certain people have more power to contribute to a toxic atmosphere of that sort, you might actually lead him to believing that we should, for example, ban certain candidates from elections. And again, I'm not necessarily arguing for Zemmour here or even for him running, but it's just an interesting consequence of Waldron's view, I think, that it might lead to that kind of management of the political sphere.
That sounds quite radical to me. The example of Zemmour, which has been on my mind as I read this book, is, I think, a good one because it shows that you can have hate speech regulations, like we have them in France. They're quite, that we've had them probably since World War II, and still have these views being very prominent in the public sphere, and have, if you want a marketplace of ideas that contains these quite extreme viewpoints on immigration and everything connected to that, you can. It seems that he's very able to communicate his message to a large, share of the French population, despite, hate speech regulations. He has to do so and expresses his idea in a way that is at least palatable. So to me, it's actually quite a piece of evidence that goes in favor of hate speech regulations, because it seems to protect us from the nastiest expressions of these views while still letting them exist in the public sphere.
I wonder if, though, it really does protect from them, or whether they're just not really there. I mean, that to me is one of the reactions that I had to a lot of the examples that he used. As you said, Baptiste, he focuses on the really extreme cases, the ones that are easiest to make. And, I don't think that, say, the United States with its First Amendment, which pretty much prohibits any kind of hate speech laws, is anything like a sort of bastion of or paradise of harmony. but neither do I think that people walk down the streets in America and see swastikas daubed everywhere and racist slogans on every building. So, which is almost the imagery that Waldron evokes in some of the things that he says in his book. So with respect to your example of France, you know, I wonder if it would be any different if you didn't have those hate speech laws in terms of what people see as kind of reasonable to be able to say or acceptable to say, because there is a social protection. And I wonder if we need the legal one if you have a liberal value base that whereby most people don't see saying nasty things about a particular race or other group of people as being acceptable.
I have some thoughts, but maybe Even, do you want to respond?
Oh no, I think that's a really interesting point, and it might be something that we touch on later. But it's just around that broader social environment and the broader social cohesion, and around what's actually effective in creating a situation where people have their dignity, and whether the legal avenue is you know, maybe there is a fair question whether it's necessary if the other conditions are fulfilled. But is there a bit of exceptionalism in that, you know, we're assuming that we've reached a certain point potentially where we won't go down the road of swastikas on the door, but is that what this kind of law might be designed to guard against as a last resort when or an alternative to the other structures if things do deteriorate in that manner? So yeah,
I'll just say one thing about that, and then I'll shut up for a minute. But one thing, I think my most fundamental objection to what Waldron is saying is that he's, not surprisingly, as a legal philosopher, he's focusing very strongly at the legal level. You know, I'm a psychologist, so that's where I go. And I actually am concerned that if you suppress ideas too strongly, you actually make them more virulent and don't protect against them. You make the people who hold those views themselves resentful and feel persecuted. And I think that actually the precursor to what happened in Germany in the 1930s is a bit of an example of that. During the 1920s, Nazis were locked up for their horrible views, and they were able to leverage that to come across as being victims in the situation. So I guess where I think that we have to, and this is not a perfect, I don't think there's any perfect solution or perfect protection against vicious ideas taking hold. But I do worry that trying to suppress them can actually be counterproductive.
Yeah, I don't know if he makes that point particularly. I can't remember.
He doesn't.
But he does touch upon this view. I can't remember the philosopher he's discussing. He touches upon this view of freedom of speech as self-disclosure. Mm-hmm. So people have rights to self-disclosure, mm-hmm. and to suppress that actually kind of deprives them of one of their rights as a human being, as a citizen. And I actually quite like that view. Does anyone remember what does he have to say against that?
He does.
Baker, I think.
What's that?
Baker. That was the last name.
Oh, okay.
That's right.
And do you remember the counterexample?
Or how he deals with that? How does he deal with that objection? Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that was a very interesting objection as well. So yeah, essentially Baker claimed, I understand, that you, in a very pluralistic, mass society, you can exist as a self by disclosing your beliefs and your positions through speech, right? And importantly, the manner in which you express yourself is also part of that self-disclosure. I think, and so if you want to disclose your views in a hateful way, then you should have the right to, because that's how you exist as a self in a society. I think the rebuttal was that you can express the view, but not in a hateful manner. So disclosing the view is what matters, but the style almost in which you do so is not so important, and the harm done by the hateful expression outweighs the benefit you gain from also getting to express the view in a hateful way.
Yeah, which I wouldn't sort of disagree with, in the sense that we, this podcast, have sort of been proponents for civility in public discourse. So all the things you're saying, I think it's possible to agree with without then doing what Waldron does and make an argument that this should be some kind of legal provision.
Well, why? So when I listen to what you're saying, it sounds to me like, putting aside the Michael's point that perhaps it could exacerbate, the legal regulation could exacerbate the actual nasty beliefs. At worst, the law would be ineffective. Like, if we have a legal restriction on the nastiest expressions of these views, and people continue to sort of, have these views and make them felt in the environment. Like, we were wondering just a moment ago about whether the protection really is there. It might not be. Like, you might say that hate speech regulations fail to provide the protection that they purport to, but I still think that there's a chance that they are effective. Like, when I see the appeal that these ideas can have in my country in the moment, I'm really concerned about what it would be if, on top of that, they were able to express themselves in a hateful way. So I'd rather have the legal regulation in case it does save us and save the members of minority groups from the very worst of what they could be exposed to.
Yeah, I guess for me, when we start talking about legal provisions, I mean, you are bringing in the state and all its coercive power, which is quite considerable. And I'm not completely against that. I'm not sort of a thoroughgoing anarchist or libertarian, but I think that it sort of raises the bar for proof and for evidence, and also for coherence. So I think, we really need to know that if we're bringing in a legal provision, that we know exactly what we're doing, and also that it's not going to have these unintended consequences. And I think that's the main thing I worry about with this, that, you may want to target certain things, but actually it's very difficult to target those things in a way which is universal. You're framing laws that are universal and fair, and also don't sort of catch other people in the net, including just innocent people and comedians and people having ordinary conversations.
Mm-hmm. And whether people already in power can be restrained by these laws is a good question as well. And I see a huge potential for the hypocrisy of powerful people to be unleashed. And as a provocative example of this, until recently, in New Zealand, the government was proposing hate speech laws to protect certain categories of people against, hate speech, however we might construe that. Those provisions have recently been shelved. The government's now saying they won't introduce that legislation in this term of Parliament. But one other thing that's happened recently in New Zealand, for anybody who's listening from overseas, is that there was a large-scale protest in the grounds of Parliament over vaccine mandates. And certainly I would say that the rhetoric coming from senior politicians, especially the Speaker of Parliament, and to some extent the Prime Minister, may well have fallen foul of Waldron's dignity test. The politicians were accusing, and certainly elements of the media as well, were accusing the protesters of being filthy people, of befouling Parliament, of all kinds of calumny, which there was very little evidence for. And I wonder whether actually they're exploiting their position of power in order to be able to assault the dignity of people who are engaging in an act of civil disobedience against a rule or a law that they disagreed with.
Well, I'm wondering, would that meet the definition of the kind of group that that we're interested in, given that I guess perhaps you could limit it to the racial and the other kinds of group.
I didn't see any intention in Waldron's book to necessarily do that. I mean, he wants to protect group dignity, and it doesn't seem to me that there's any obstacle to saying the group might be a group who believes in a certain kind of liberty, for example, from vaccine mandates. Should they be subject to attacks on their dignity that, say, a racial group is protected from.
Well, he would probably want to say something like, well, the avenue is open for someone to say, well, that's just a temporary group. But then this is the slippery thing about categories like ethnicity and religion. I mean, how long do you have to believe something for it to be counted as a religion, right? Because if you're just a cult, like Nextquiem, I just watched this 9-hour documentary about this cult in the States, or Scientology, you know, does that allow you the protections of a group agency or group identity of the sort that Waldron wants?
Wouldn't it have to, under his underpinning idea that we want a liberal democratic society to be free of an intimidating atmosphere? It shouldn't really matter who it is that's
no, I think I agree
the target of that.
I think I agree with you. And then the question would be, was what the New Zealand politicians said about the protesters sufficient that they would lose, people would stop thinking of them as equal citizens and they would risk being deprived of their rights? I mean, I kind of think that
they were already deprived of their rights.
I kind of think that test was already passed by the lockdowns, but so others might.
Well, not so much the lockdowns as the mandate, which divided, at the Prime Minister's explicit admission, divided our society into two groups, one that had more rights than the other. And she said that out off the bat.
So this is kind of another objection I have, which may sound like a weird objection, because what I'm saying is basically, in a way, I think Waldron takes depriving other people of rights too seriously, in a sense. I know that sounds an awful thing to say, because depriving people of rights is a bad thing. However, I mean, depriving people of all their rights is a bad thing. However, we kind of do it all the time. And I'm sort of thinking of, and maybe you would argue in a particular case that we shouldn't. So for example, in the States, if you're a prisoner, you're not allowed to vote. Okay, I think I'm against that. I think prisoners should be allowed to vote. But for Waldron, you shouldn't even be able to argue that prisoners shouldn't be allowed to vote, because that would risk depriving prisoners of equality and their rights as citizens, right? And another category which I'm in, and I guess Baptista's in as well, is immigrants. And I guess Michael in Australia, when he was in Australia. So, and I don't want to go full Eric Zemmour here, but it just strikes me that it's a very routine thing that nation states distinguish between certain categories of people in a way which doesn't usually strike us as that dangerous. So in many countries, if you're an immigrant, you can't vote. I don't think I could vote for the first 2 years that I was in New Zealand. And New Zealand's quite generous with this, like you can vote as a resident. But in other countries, you can't vote unless you're a citizen. Okay, so then again, you might be against that. You might want to argue that they should, but Waldron's view seems so strong that he would want to disallow people arguing that citizens shouldn't be allowed to vote, because that would deprive them of certain rights of citizenship and they wouldn't be absolutely equal to all citizens, right? Baptiste, you're skeptical.
Can I respond to that? Yeah, I didn't understand Waldron to say that. I think
neither did I. Go ahead, Baptiste.
I think he really distinguishes between the ideas and the manner in which they're expressed. So my reading of him is that he would say, by all means, well, if you would like to discuss the position that prisoners should be deprived of the right to vote, go ahead, but do so in a way that's not hateful, so that prisoners, retain some sort of social standing in the discussion. So I was very convinced by this distinction between the ideas. It's just difficult to put into practice. How do you express the view if you have the view that some group of humans are subhumans? Is there a way to express that idea in a way that's not hateful? I don't know. But in most cases, distinguishing the idea, which should be able to be voiced, and then the hateful expression of it makes a whole lot of sense to me. And I think that's what Waldron is defending.
So let's probe into that a bit. And I don't think that prisoners are a very good example, because in some sense they have had rights stripped from them punitively. So that's why they're prisoners. They've committed some crime and now they're in prison. So and that entails a loss of dignity. So a loss of dignity has been imposed on them as a punishment. But let's sort of veer away from that a little bit. What I'm interested in is your embracing of the idea that we might be able to separate the expression of an idea from the mode or the manner in which it's expressed. And, for that example, to trouble that example, I think religion is quite a useful category to look at, because And Waldron does make this point. To be fair to him, he says that it is a fair point that if you're trying to separate a religious idea from the person who holds it, people who are very religious see their religion as being part of them in a way that is almost inalienable. So you're asking them, I think, as he puts it, to take off their skin if they're being asked to talk about the religion or the ideas of the religion in isolation from their identity or separately from their identity. And so how might we negotiate that? Because as you say, maybe this idea has some appeal in theory, but the practice of it may be very difficult. And the practice of it does end up mattering at some point if it's going to be more than just a book about philosophy.
Does someone want to respond?
Do you want to respond?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I think let's take that example. And I'm sorry, I'm going to speak from the culture I know most, which is once again France. We've had for many years now a debate about the hijab, the veil that Muslim women wear. So if we're going to talk about religious groups, I think it is very possible. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism. The main criticism is that it's oppressive of women. And I think you can voice that in a way that will certainly displease a lot of members of Islam, but in a way that is not hateful. I happen to, it's hard. It's a hard one. I don't have a strong opinion on that one, but I can imagine very well a way to express that opinion that would be hateful, in that it would characterize most Muslims or all Muslims as very retrograde and just completely disrespectful or not respecting the humanity of half of the population. Or you could talk about it in a way that targets the practice, contextualizes it, and you could make a sort of a case for it based on interpretation of the religious text, based on the legal framework in place in whatever country, and that's being done all the time in a way that to me would satisfy the test of not being hateful, yet very much contains the idea that you want to express.
I'm glad you raised the burqa ban, or the whatever you want to call it, as an example, because I think it is actually.
So I didn't mean the burqa, but that's another important example.
Right. But in any event, so say, France takes the view that certain Muslim women's clothing or traditional dress is to be banned because it's an assault on the dignity of women to make them wear this. There's an irony in that, isn't there? Because we're invoking a kind of authoritarian structure to ban something on the grounds that it is oppressive. In other words, we're saying Muslim women's dignity is being undermined by a culture that forces them to dress like this. So in some sense, we're going to impose another assault on their dignity to rob them of the choice to wear that if they want to. And the reason that I'm raising this, because I think it does bring to light a problem in the idea of hate speech legislation on Waldron's grounds more generally, which is that we are assuming that if we impose these laws, in some sense, we're assaulting the dignity of the people who are supposedly protected, because we're saying that they need that protection, that they're not strong enough or able to be vocal enough, despite having free speech, to defend themselves.
Which could be called group libel, right? I mean,
that's my point.
I'm not trying to make that a cheap point, but
no, I'm not either.
It seems to meet Waldron's own criteria.
There seems to me a paradox there.
Yeah.
Can I disagree?
Please.
Yeah,
I'd love you to.
I disagree because if Waldron and I'm right, if it's true that you can distinguish the idea from the hateful expression, you still have very much to contend with the idea. Like a lot of Muslim people in France currently have to contend with those ideas around the the Vale, about the current politics of like Zemmour. So they're still very much having to do this intellectual and more than that, maybe like sort of cultural defense. I think they would prefer to, that's already a lot of work to do to defend their dignity. I think they would prefer to not also have to deal with all of this, but expressed in a hateful manner. I think it would make their job more difficult. I don't know that they would feel infantilized by the fact that there are some boundaries on how nasty people who deny their rights can express their opinions.
Perhaps so. Evan, do you want to come in there? Or?
I haven't formed a solid view. I'm following and enjoying it.
Yeah.
I was actually just because we had that little pause, I wanted to sort of back up a little bit because just going back to the core view, because I just wrote down a couple of things that struck me as useful in getting to what's really at the core of his view. I mean, and you guys, I think, already think I'm barking up the wrong tree slightly, so feel free to disagree even with the idea that this is the core of his view. But one analogy that he has that I thought was quite useful and interesting was that group defamation or group libel isn't about offense, it's about dignity. It's about removing people's dignity,
yes,
or undermining people's dignity as a group. And he says this is kind of like contempt of court. So we have contempt of court laws, which are supposed to stop judges from losing their dignity in a way which prevents the judge then performing their role as a judge. So if you kind of swear at the judge and that's allowed to happen in the courtroom, the judge will lose dignity to the extent that his authority, or their authority, I should say, is undermined in the courtroom. And so Waldron thinks that in a similar way, libel against groups within democratic societies undermines the groups in question's ability, and this is a quotation, to be respected in their character as equals and accorded the authority associated with their vote and their basic rights. So that's what I think he's really getting at. He's linking conception of people as equals with their rights. And I actually, I mean, maybe you'll disagree even with me saying that's the core of his view, but here too, I'm actually not so sure of that, because I think that there are many ways in which we can talk about people as not equal without thinking that they don't deserve rights as human beings. And some of them are just so routine that we almost don't even notice them. So it's just sort of obviously the case. I think some people are slower at running. Some people have less upper body strength. And you think, well, obviously we're not going to test people on their weightlifting capacity and then deprive them of citizenship. Okay, so let's make it a little bit more controversial. What if I say women have less upper body strength than men? That's also true. And I think, a lot of people recognize that, but it hasn't led to women being deprived of their rights. I mean, maybe in the past, in the distant past, it was part of the reason. It was part of the rationale.
It certainly allows men to physically dominate women.
But I mean, that's obviously a problem, but it's not Waldron's problem in the sense that it
doesn't of itself abrogate female dignity.
He seems to be linking these things. He seems to take that link as quite self-explanatory, that once you start saying certain people are unequal, then they're going to be deprived of their rights. And I think, I mean, maybe he would just laugh at these examples and say, well, obviously what I mean is something more serious than that you're saying that they're not really human. But then I would say to him, well, if you want to be a proper philosopher, and he's obviously a very distinguished philosopher, then you need to build that into your theory. So what is it? So it's not just people's equality being undermined, it's specifically this very extreme thing that you're calling them subhuman.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, because, if we take libel laws as they stand, civil libel laws against slander or publishing slanderous material about people, then a defense against that is truth, right? And so I won't get into specific examples, but the upper body strength one is quite a good one. Different groups of people are different in certain ways, and sometimes they may be different on a dimension that is of value in some sense. In other words, one group has more of something of value than another. Now, it could be construed that even just saying that is an assault on the dignity of the group who doesn't have as much of that quality as another group. no matter how gently we say it or how non-hatefully we say it, it could be construed as an assault on dignity because we're drawing attention to a dimension on which they are sort of objectively inferior.
So you're going to have to fill that out, I think, because it's taking us into some very controversial territory. But
well, that's why I'm avoiding specific examples.
No, but I think I know what you mean. But in a way, surprisingly for me, I would push back there against the sense of objective because, I mean, I've just been reading Thomas Sowell on differences between groups, and Thomas Sowell is a great American economist now in his 80s or 90s, I think. And one of the things he writes about is that certain cultures are basically better. They're better at exploiting the market economy. And so he thinks that some of the differences in wealth distribution you see in the United States, for example, are due to this kind of cultural propensity. Okay, you cannot argue with him about that, but I think that's the kind of thing you have in mind, right? So maybe certain groups of people, maybe the Australians who come to New Zealand are just much better at dentistry.
I mean, that's why
they're really good dentistry schools in Australia. They come in and they're better at dentistry.
It could be even worse than that, though, as in the case of upper body strength, where it's actually a biological fact.
Yeah, I think it's a delicate but very important point, Michael. If I understand correctly, if I remember from the book correctly, Australia, for example, in its hate speech regulations, has a provision for scientific and I think it had artistic also, context in which you might be able to say things that you wouldn't outside of these contexts. So I think that point has been, built in some hate speech regulations around the world, that there might be empirical evidence that needs to be discussed, even when it might suggest something very uncomfortable, and that such that there could be a group difference in something very valuable and important. I'm not sure how what's the best legal way to do this, but I certainly agree that we can't ban the expression of empirical findings. But my understanding is that in most countries, like with these sort of books and stuff, people have been able to express, they've encountered backlash, but that's to be expected. But the truth, the empirical findings, to the extent that they capture truth, have been put out there, and then people discuss, whether the explanation is, to be found in the environment, and which, is it like that they're better at navigating the market economy? Is it, early socialization, whatever? But it seems like we're currently able to do this, including in countries where there are hate speech regulations. So that suggests to me that it is possible to design the hate speech regulations in a way that so that they don't capture, or those empirical studies don't fall in the net of hate speech.
Yeah, but so here again, I think that in a way, what Waldron presents his view as a reasonably moderate one and in line with a lot of the way that hate speech legislation is framed. But I actually see the implications of his philosophical position as quite strong because, as I say, if you accept this link between equality and citizenship rights, it seems to suggest that any of these conversations we've just been having, I think his worry is, and I'll frame it as a worry or a concern, because I think that's the most sort of sympathetic way of understanding it. And I sort of share the same concerns. I mean, you can't have lived in the 20th century or know about the 20th century without having some of the same concerns. So his concern is once we start talking about differences between people, then this is somewhere along the road to Auschwitz. And I as I say, I find that concern extremely understandable, but I also think that we don't need to catastrophize about this. And actually, there are many routine ways in which we can talk about differences without us immediately becoming Nazis.
I agree. I think we should be all very careful when having these discussions. But when he talks about equality, do you take him to mean, perfect equality? I understood equality quite minimally in the sense that he was using it. I think he meant equal in citizens' ability to go about their business in society, right? Yeah, not equal intelligence, same degree of morality, just equal in their ability to navigate society, to go about their.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's another quote here that might just help clarify this. So he says the point is to stop, certain vicious kinds of messages from becoming part of the landscape. So he's very much about the atmosphere that's being created rather than, explicit inequality as such.
I guess the concern is essentially, is it that it becomes political and sort of cultural norms of the moment start to dictate. But I mean, is that a tension that sort of always exists in the law, tries hard to resolve with a certain amount of specificity and jurisprudence that helps that? I mean, with the New Zealand legislation that we had previously in the defamation, which refers to sort of ridicule, and that I understand that sort of very few people, if like one or two or something, may have been prosecuted under it. So it suggests that judges do, bear in mind these cultural sort of concerns, I suppose, or seek to obtain. I mean, I'm not familiar with the territory, but somewhat of an objective view across, the intention and where some of that slippery slope concern comes in. They're working hard to push against it, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, maybe another interpretation of that is that actually it's the values of a society that carry the day in the end, for better or worse. So, I'm quite a proponent of the idea that politics and ultimately law are downstream from culture. So they have a very hard time pushing against cultural tides, and in fact will be pushed in the direction of the cultural tide. And as you say, Evan, judges will interpret laws according to the prevailing values. And it may be that in that interpretation, certain prejudices that are present in the value base of a society will still play out, so that one group might end up being protected more than another because of those underlying prejudices. So maybe this is a pessimistic view, or at least it is for a legal solution to the problem, because I don't think that laws or political forces can restrain evil in the end, and I'll use that word, evil. If there are evil ideas abroad, then the only way that they can be defeated is by people standing up to them with courage and defending the dignity of people who are so assaulted.
Well, I mean, presumably Waldron and others who have proposed and defended hate speech laws think something like this, that there's a point at which those evil doers, as you put it, and I don't disagree, will take over society. And again, the Nazi example is the most obvious one. And they'll take over society, and then there's nothing that can be done about it. And it doesn't really matter if you have a flimsy law. If there's some tyrant like Hitler, he'll just completely disregard it. Okay, but I think what they would argue is, well, before that happens, we may be able to delay the emergence of a toxic culture that leads to those situations.
Yeah, I agree with that. If I can build on that. Sorry, were you finished?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm going back to Xamor just for a moment, because I think it illustrates this. He's been convicted a few times of hate speech violations, and I think that helps a lot of people who might otherwise be drawn to his ideas sort of back off. So it signals, I guess the law might not be very effective. I think that's probably true. It's not very effective at preventing, pretty despicable ideas, but it might act as a signal that, someone's views have been known to veer beyond the threshold that the law is determined to be acceptable. Therefore, we should be wary of these views.
You don't think that Zamor's followers may have been solidified in their views by an idea that he's been persecuted and he's a bit of a martyr or anything like that?
Yeah, so he definitely avails himself of that. But I think he would regardless, because I think it's a good point. It's a common narrative that, you know, these sort of alt-right, you know, leaders around the world have been using, that they've persecuted. But if it wasn't by the law, it would be by the media. And if it wasn't by the media, it would be by the, you know, the intelligentsia. And in fact, he says he's persecuted by all three, you know, all three groups. So it's not like the law is making that happen. It's just one more layer of persecution on the poor, poor martyr.
Sure. I guess, you know, maybe this is my kind of Pollyanna-ish view, or my kind of idealistic view of how to deal with these things, but perhaps it would be far harder to make the claim of being a martyr if the pushback was coming from the vox populi very strongly. So not necessarily the media or the intelligentsia, but, you know, conversations people have around, you know, ordinary people, working class people, people from every class saying, you know, we find this idea that certain races are inferior terribly offensive, and this guy who's saying it, I want no part of what he's doing. And then it's much harder to say I'm a martyr, because actually you're just saying something unpopular.
Yeah. Yeah, what was I going to say? Yeah, I think that question, I mean, basically what you're arguing, one of the things you were arguing about there for a while was, what is actually the case? Is it the case that having a law against somebody saying certain things dampens down support for those things? Or is it the case instead that having a law against people saying certain things increases support for the people saying those things? And of course, there's going to be some movement in each direction. But it's interesting because that strikes me as an empirical question, whether there's a net effect one way or the other. But so just taking a slightly different tack now, I've said this before, I mean, what I worry about more with the hate speech legislation isn't so much this effect of people saying they're suppressing us, although I do worry about that as well, like Michael. It's more these sort of unintended consequences of, are we all, how often are we really in the Hitler situation? How close are we to the Hitler situation? And if we're not that close to it, do we really want to risk just basically criminalizing very ordinary speech and humor and people's ability to live in a free society and not feel that they're constantly being watched, or that they're going to get in trouble, that they're going to get fired? And that, I think, is actually a problem right now, not specifically because of hate speech laws, although actually in the UK, hate speech laws have led to people being arrested for making jokes. So that is a real worry. But so going back to what we were saying before, Baptiste, I mean, I think you're probably right that Waldron thinks of the equality that he's talking about as a kind of moral equality. And that really what he's worried about is the kinds of speech that lead to us thinking of people as just not morally equal. That we don't really care if people can't run as fast as some other group of people, you know, the slow runner group versus the quick runner group. What we really care about is if people are treated like they're not human beings, or they're not worthy of citizenship. Okay, that's fine. So, but for me, that actually places quite a high bar on this. And it's one that I think that Waldron is kind of below himself. So in other words, I think that he's saying, oh, look, my view of hate speech is just that it's only going to be operative when you have these very strong threats to conceptions of people as human beings and equal citizens. And then he has some examples, and one of them I put an exclamation mark next to it in the text, because he's talking about the Tea Party. I mean, this book is written, I think, 2012, so it's a while ago. But if you can remember the Tea Party in the States, they were kind of I guess a sort of libertarian inflected Republican right-wing group. And he's talking about them, and he says, well, if people claim that the Tea Party politicians cannot be trusted with public funds, or that they are dishonest, he thinks that might be grounds for libel. Right, so that's a kind of group libel for him. So that just saying that the Tea Party politicians are dishonest, or that they cannot be trusted with public funds. And again, I just think that's the kind of claim that people make all the time. I mean, and
they have to be able to make in a democracy,
yeah, exactly.
Or you can't criticize power.
Exactly, and that you can see that's in the public interest to say, I think this politician is corrupt. I mean, maybe they're not, maybe they are, but you should be able to say that, right? So I think his bar in principle it's quite high. In practice, it's actually alarmingly low.
It's a good example that you pulled there. Do you remember if he meant, you know, politicians who belong to the party, or every citizen who adheres to the ideas of the party?
He's talking about politicians.
Yeah, I think he's talking about politicians. I mean, so I would be even more alarmed if he was talking about everybody involved with the Tea Party movement, but I think he's talking just about sort of politicians in some kind of formal role. But even there, I think that the bar is too low. I mean, I think, you should still be able to say of a politician, I think
I agree.
corrupt.
Because it's a relevant, if it was true that a group of politicians from one party were prone to corruption, you would want to be able to say that. So
and I also think that this, again, he's worrying too much in a sense, because I think we routinely say, like in the mid and early 90s in Britain, the Conservatives had a problem with corruption, and then people were talking about sleazy Tories. And I think that was kind of an accurate perception, as it turned out at the time. And yet it's not the case that the Conservative Party of Britain, that they've been persecuted, or that they've been deprived of their rights, or that they've even been unsuccessful. In fact, they've since come back, and now they're the governing party.
Yeah, I agree with that. That sounds that should not be prohibited by hate speech regulation.
It does possibly, illustrate the difficulty of drawing the distinction that I think Waldron would certainly like to draw, and I think you're attracted to, Baptiste, between what is said and the manner in which it's said. There's one more point. I mean, we may be coming towards the end, but there's one more point I'd just like to draw out that he makes towards the end of the book. And he asks, do we give the advantages of free speech the benefit of the doubt? Should we be given, in other words, in considering the balance between free speech and protecting people from attacks on their dignity, why should we give the advantages of free speech, and we all agree that they exist, why should we give them the benefit of the doubt over the question of whether people should have their dignity protected? And here, to me, is where I probably depart from him most strongly, because he's not very impressed by the marketplace of ideas argument, as he puts it. He actually draws an analogy with market economy and says that we might recognize that market economies are very efficient in productivity and producing wealth, but also they produce inequality, and so we need the state to intervene in economic ways to protect the casualties of the market. In the same way, the marketplace of ideas produces casualties who need to have their big dignity protected. Now, to me, what that overlooks is the kind of deep level on which, what he calls the marketplace of ideas works. And I don't actually even want to call it the marketplace of ideas, because I think it does invite too much of a comparison with the economic case. But to me, the point is that what we have is a whole lot of conversations going on in a culture at every moment. This is an example of one that is being broadcast on YouTube, and people have others just in their living rooms, or they have them in public, or they have them on the radio, or wherever it might be. All of these conversations are going on at once. And it seems to me that the history of the 20th century tells us many things. One is very much a warning of what can happen and what can go wrong when authority and power is vested in malevolent people. But another trajectory that we might look at is actually towards more and more liberal societies, especially in the second half of the 20th century. And I would contend that what maybe allowed that to happen is this, bubbling away of all of these different conversations and ideas being promulgated and tested and argued about in a very open kind of way, at a time when any kind of restriction on speech, certainly in the Anglosphere, and I suspect in Western Europe as well, was looked upon as being very suspect. We saw the civil rights movement be very successful in the United States, for example, in that kind of environment where people were free to talk about things in a way that they wouldn't have been 50 years earlier. So I wonder if, he is selling short, what he calls the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, I think you make a very good case for it. If we can have a distinction between the idea and the manner in which it is expressed, then I would argue that this interplay of ideas, if we don't want to call them markets, will be enhanced, and it's going to be even more likely to bring valuable goods if we can somehow prevent very nasty expressions from polluting it.
I completely agree with that. Perhaps our point of disagreement is whether the best mechanism for that is a legal one or a cultural one.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Baptiste, you go on.
No, please.
Go ahead, Evan, please.
I mean, that was we're thinking throughout was around the effectiveness and also, I guess because it was a sort of a legally sort of thing, the context seemed very different from sort of modern life and perhaps some of the issues that we are confronted with now around the internet and, various spaces, echo chambers around the place. And so my query was just around effectiveness, that just the sheer volume of, some of these sites is proliferating, daily, let alone the actual content that's flowing through them. So I guess, under that view, would the social media companies have some responsibility or something, or would they pick out occasional internet content and choose to somehow find, the individual who published it and put them through this process? It struck me as perhaps insufficient to have just a legal thing, although I don't necessarily disagree with some form of hate speech. But yeah, my question was around the effectiveness.
Yeah, I do, to be honest, Baptiste, I do have some worries about even this idea of clamping down on the way that people express certain things and the sort of nastiness, as you put it. Even though there are obviously things that I think are nasty, but it can be quite complicated. And again, I think if you watch Family Guy, or something like that, you can often have the experience of watching it with some friends or someone in your family, and they might think it's horrible. They might think that joke is terrible, right? And it's very similar to the way in which maybe if you were watching The Life of Brian or in the 70s, that Christians would think that's horrible. They wouldn't think that's a funny joke. They would think that's a nasty joke. They think they're mocking my religion, and that's a nasty thing. And so I think a lot of the time these things are very much in the eye of the beholder. Now, I know that Waldron wants to say, well, no, there's a more objective way of looking at it. You look at, we disagreed slightly about this, but I think he's saying you look at what the whole of society thinks. And there I think there's actually something to be said for trying to conceive of ourselves as a liberal society and as a tolerant society, in the sense that we can take a certain amount of Mickey taking, and okay, at a certain point, these things become more serious than that. But I think it's important to just have a certain robustness as a society that, yes, there can be situations which lead to the Hitler nightmare, but there are many kinds of jokes and even criticisms and debates which actually we can cope with as a society. And again, Waldron will say, well, you're saying that because you're not a minority. But it's interesting when you actually poll people on these things. For example, there was a survey by the UK based group More in Common, where they surveyed different groups of Americans about political correctness. And most of the ethnic minority groups were against political correctness on the grounds that, it clamps down on normal expression, you don't know what to say. So yeah, so I guess these are sort of my closing thoughts. Maybe we should just do closing thoughts. So that's mine, and maybe you can have, and then we'll get back to the last word.
Well, I think I've already said my closing thoughts, which in the end, to me, the solution to this problem, to the extent that it can be solved, is through culture. And I'm skeptical of the idea that laws in the end will have much influence or backwash on the culture. I think in the end they'll be swept away by cultural tides. So to me, the emphasis, and this may be something that resonates with you, Baptiste, in terms of your focus on philosophy for children. To me, the key is through educating children to contest ideas respectfully, which is not a small thing to do.
Yeah, so I can only agree with that. But I will, for today at least, continue to believe that the legal regulation can help, even if it's at the cultural level and so educational level that most of the work has to happen. I think the legal can help, or at worst be ineffective. So that's what I think there. And then, yeah, James, I agree. I don't have a very good way of distinguishing, nasty was probably not the right word, but hateful is we want to prohibit, I would like to prohibit hateful expressions of ideas. I really think there are two thresholds here. The one for offense, and so if you poll people on political offense, then they might say, well, political correctness, sorry. They might say, well, no, that threshold is way too low. I would like to live in a society that allows for these jokes, these sort of speech acts. But I think we could have a threshold that would be significantly higher for hateful, expression of ideas. It's an empirical question, but I would think most people from minorities, would probably want to live in a society that has, a hate speech regulation with a high threshold like that would probably benefit.
Okay, great. So thanks very much, everybody. I think we all agree. I mean, we've taken slightly different views here, and maybe even slightly we've been convinced by Waldron to differing extents. But I think we probably all think this was a useful exercise. And
I think it was brilliant, and I really want to thank our guests, Evan and Baptiste, for a great conversation.
And we should say as well, I mean, I think that the Waldron book is a good one. I mean, if people, it's a good thing to do. I mean, I say this to my students too. If you want to engage with a view, or you want to investigate an issue, one great thing to do is try and find the strongest views on each side, or maybe there's more than two sides. Try and find 3 or 4 strong views. I think Waldron was a very eloquent defender of the view that he takes, so hopefully we've also exemplified the merits of open argument in this little session, and we'll try and continue to do so on Free Kiwis. So thanks for anybody who's watching or tuned in, and thanks to the guests, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.